Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 60 and 61. Let's begin. Chiyo Shuzenji read from a clipboard. She knew the injuries but she wanted to make sure that none were forgotten. A lifetime of dealing with heroes meant she knew how they were. They'd try to get up and out before they were healed correctly. In that way, she was somewhat thankful for the side effects of her quirk. Heroes, or civilians couldn't get up if they were sleeping off the healing her quirk gave them. Chiyo wondered what others with healing quirks thought, especially those that didn't cause fatigue or other side effects to keep the subject subdued. Toshinori, Chiyo shook her head. This is serious. I know, the number one hero told her before gesturing for her to continue. All right, the strain on your hamstrings and ligaments will heal. Moving up to your groin and abdomen, she sighed heavily. Your guts have been stitched together from the bits we could find. Your large intestine is about a third shorter than it should be and your small intestine is about half as long. You're on a whole suit of antibiotics to reduce the chance of infection, and of course healing quirks have been used, but there are going to be lifelong consequences. Your left kidney is gone and we had to cut down your liver down to save it. I don't know who you thank that your spleen is intact, because your stomach and left lung took the brunt of the damage. And they have both been removed. Your heart had shrapnel in it and we had to stitch that back up. Shrapnel was not the right term. Bone was, but it had acted in the same manner. A lot of quirk healing had been done on his heart, and to give his body strength to endure. With wounds that bad, the patient needed a lot of strength to pull through. You know what that means though, don't you? Chiyo asked. Over the time she had learned that when discussing life-changing news, it was best to make the patient say the words. It might be cruel, but it made them accept it more. It was odd to see All Might sigh. I can't, he said finally. You can't what? I can't retire, he told her. Chiyo shook her head. With these injuries, you aren't going to have a choice. You can't get into another battle. I have to, he told her. At that, Chiyo knew she wasn't speaking to Toshinori, but to All Might, the number one hero. You don't have to comfort me, she snapped. You have to acknowledge reality, Chiyo added with a glare. The country needs a pillar. She shook her head. Definitely speaking with the number one hero and not the man. At what cost? Chiyo asked instead. You can't go on with those injuries. Accept it, that you got him, and retire on that note. All Might shook his head. Now is not the time. The country would be thrown into turmoil if I retire now. I have to continue. Chiyo sighed again, blowing out her breath heavily, and gave up for the moment. She knew when it was a lost cause. See me about your diet when you are checked out, she said instead. Though I know my colleagues will talk to you about that. But I can provide extra information, Chiyo clarified. She had faith that the doctors would be giving Toshinori a full rundown, but she knew he probably wouldn't listen. When he ran into problems, she'd be there to sort him out. He was going to run into problems, if not with his digestion, then with pins and needles in his left leg from compromised circulation, with blood or liquid on his remaining lung, with a whole host of potential problems that would arise from injuries that bad. She took a step back, shaking her head as the commissioner of the Hero Public Safety Commission stepped forward. Sir, Toshinori greeted Commissioner Haruta. All Might, the man replied before he took a seat. Who was he? The commissioner asked. I've read the reports, but who was he to you? They cleaned his brain matter out from under your fingernails. So who did you hate that much? Toshinori sighed. I'm sure Mirai has told you? He made the statement a question. Commissioner Sukin nodded. Sir Nightai has been a great help, but I want to hear it from you. All for one, Yagi murmured. I don't know his real name. I don't really know much about him. It doesn't seem like many people do, the commissioner agreed. Hisashi Riji is a fiction we are quickly finding appears solid, but is like smoke, which is why I want to know what you know. If you've read the reports, then you know just about everything I know. His quirk was named All for One. It allowed him to take other people's quirks, to either use for himself, or to give to others so that they serve him. He was born when quirks were new and has been fighting for something ever since then. He killed my mentor, Nana Shimura. But not before she gave you her quirk, Commissioner Sukin mused. Chiyo could hear the man's longing and she was thankful she was standing behind him. She sent a sharp look towards the number one hero, but All Might's visage displayed nothing. He had to have heard the desire in the man's voice though. It was impossible to miss. Not before she gave me her quirk. All Might confirmed. But before I was fully trained. Once I was trained, I've been looking for him ever since. Well, you found him and now we are here. Now we are here, All Might agreed. Chiyo was thankful that he was astute enough to not say anything else. She worked with the commission, but that didn't mean she liked them. It wasn't anything the commission did specifically, but rather that they were involved in politics. That always leads to compromises, and they weren't always the best compromises. Compromises such as pinning the blame on Toxic Chainsaw. She understood why. To the public, Hitoshi Rigi was a legitimate businessman. To reveal that he was deeply involved in the underworld would greatly erode public confidence in the system. To reveal that his quirk was to take other quirks would go a long way to destroying it. She understood why the blame was put on Toxic Chainsaw. She understood why they couldn't tell the public the truth, but she didn't have to like it. He underestimated me. He underestimated how much I needed to take him out, Toshinori said softly. He was arrogant, at first. Assured. He wasn't even desperate at the end. I think he still believed he'd win. He was a very powerful man, Sukin nodded. That could be interpreted several ways. There was no doubt that All for One was physically powerful, but Hitoshi Rigi had been powerful in the world of business. All Might nodded. I only hope those he killed can rest in peace now. And those he stole quirks from they will never know he's gone, but I hope they can find some comfort. What else do you know about him? The pensive look gracing Toshinori's face vanished and he looked directly into the commissioner's eyes. For someone who wanted my quirk, he was very quick to use lethal force. That got a reaction. He wanted your quirk? Sukin demanded. Chiyo could hear the horror in his voice at the thought. All for One was powerful with his own quirk. With All Might's quirk he would be unstoppable. I am the 8th holder of One for All. The original holder was his brother. My quirk is the last remnant of his brother. He created One for All when he gave his brother a quirk, All Might summarized for the commissioner. Chiyo realized that it was all in one of the reports and she wondered how closely the commissioner had read them. It wasn't really her concern. Sukin nodded. So, when will you be back? He asked, shifting the conversation away from All for One. He won't, Chiyo snapped at the same time as Toshinori said soon. You won't. She growled. Did you not hear me earlier? The world needs me, Toshinori replied softly. Especially now, when I'm sure there is chaos from his removal. Sukin nodded sagely. Chiyo fumed, already knowing she had lost the argument. She huffed. Just try to take it easy, she implored. Apparently, that was all she could do for now. All for One breathed heavily as he lay back on the bed. Pain racked his form and he held back a grimace. Copying quirks was painful, but there was no other way of doing it. He forced himself to focus on other things. Izuku was his choice of thought. His son had returned to school and Kurogiri had reported that there was no one looking at him. That was good. It meant that the captain had done his job in pulling back the detective. But it meant he had to see to Izuku's education now. His son didn't want to replace him. That was understandable, but his son would have to take a more active role. He would have to teach his son how to take quirks. That would need to be orchestrated carefully so that Izuku didn't feel guilty. But he would also need to teach his son about money and investment. An education in investment could be done for Izuku's birthday. That was about 6 months away, but there was no rush on that. It would be necessary to get Izuku to take a quirk before then. Something small but important. How could he do that? He knew how it could be done, but he wasn't sure how to arrange it. For the first time since the fight with All Might, Hitoshi regretted losing one of his employees. Usually he could replace them, but right at the moment. He needed Nasuto. He needed the contacts the man had. Mentally he sighed, but physically he grimaced. It was a consequence of allowing his organization to become so large that he couldn't take care of everything himself. He dismissed that thought. There was no point in dwelling on it. Kurogiri had a broker who provided items. He would have to see how the man, or was it a woman, dealt with other requests. Thinking of Kurogiri brought him to another point of Izuku's training. He would have to get an update. And if necessary, accelerate it. A wave of pain passed through him and Hitoshi couldn't help the small gasp that escaped him. He stopped thinking about the present and cast his mind to the future. Tomura had a group helping him and was out in the world, attacking heroes. Izuku stood beside him, a prince of the underworld, carrying out his will, and establishing himself as a power that was not to be trifled with. And the buffoon that was All Might was kneeling before him, broken and bleeding. That image was cathartic, and for a moment it drove away the pain, but All for One was realistic. He knew what it would take. Him, fully healed, would be easily able to do it, but he recognized that on some level that wasn't going to happen. At least, not now, not yet, not without some other change. That wasn't what he was meant to be thinking about, no matter how pleasurable it was. However, if he could get Izuku to a certain degree of strength, then he could defeat All Might. Not now. Probably not for another 8 to 9 years, but it could be possible. Which is why he was going through this pain. Izuku would need these quirks. He would benefit from them, and they would be the basis of All Might's defeat. And All for One didn't smile, but he knew if he gave his son a goal, then Izuku would embrace it. He might not yet fully hate All Might, despite everything that had happened. Izuku would probably view the man as a victim of the system, but it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to shift that view from victim to sympathizer. And from there to collaborator to pillar. If nothing else, it would please Tomura. And a new thought came to Hitoshi. Izuku's quirk was like his. He could take quirks, and only through interference from Dr. Garaki could he give them away. He could not remove one for all from that buffoon All Might, but there were a number of possibilities for that. It could be because it was a feature of his brother's original quirk. Or it could be because he gave his brother the stockpiling quirk. It wasn't a function of his own quirk. He had taken and given the same quirk from the same person multiple times in the past. His brother's quirk and his were related. He might not be able to take it simply because of that fact. However, while Izuku's quirk was also technically related, it was not as strong a relationship. There was a possibility that Izuku could retrieve one for all for him. Now that was something that bore thinking about. It shouldn't be too hard to get Izuku into the vicinity of All Might to test his theory. His fingers twitched at the thought as the pain continued to wash through him. So, for Izuku, he had to see to his training, especially once he got the quirks that were being copied. Arrangements had to be made to ease Izuku into the thought that taking quirks was a good thing, and when Izuku had his birthday, he would have to see that he began learning about finances and investment. That would serve his son well. As for Tomura, no, nothing really needed to be done there. The teen was currently awash with hatred but was still too young to truly begin moving in the world. In a few more years, he would give the teen some tasks to set him on his path. Maybe Tomura could use the prototypes. Yes, that would work. He took a deep breath again, fighting against the respirator's rhythm. That would have to be changed. He was not going to breathe on the timing of a machine. It would obey him, not the other way around. But for now, all he had to do was wait. Things would come together. They might require a nudge, but things would come together. He would see the world at his feet. He would see yet another user of his brother's quirk bloody and broken at his feet. It was just a matter of time. Hitoshi. Izuku called happily. The purple-haired boy looked around before his eyes fixed onto his friend. I still can't get used to you with brown hair. He grumbled as he moved forward. I told you why, Izuku replied, still happy. I know, and it sucks, Hitoshi replied as they began walking. He'd arrived in Mie Prefecture over the short winter break. Izuku had been waiting for him on the day he arrived, and it felt like the 6 months apart had never happened. Hitoshi was happy to see Izuku, but he knew his friend was hurting. Izuku hadn't said much, except to say that his dad was healed as much as he could be but was still requiring medical attention all the time. If Hitoshi was honest, he missed Izuku's dad. He hadn't met Hitoshi that often, but the man had always been honest with him and was always in good humor. It had been nice to talk to someone who knew what his quirk was but who, like Izuku, was genuinely unafraid of him. His mum and dad tried, but he could tell they remembered the past, when he'd accidentally used his quirk on them. He didn't know, but when it first came in he hadn't realized what was happening. Having Izuku and his dad talk to him without even batting an eye had been a balm he hadn't even realized he'd needed. And now Izuku was sad. He didn't show it all the time, but it was underlying everything he did. Hitoshi had only seen him a few times since they'd moved, but he'd been able to see that. I had Kurogiri and Tomura help me with some stats, and I just don't get why people think heroes are great, Izuku said softly. Hitoshi looked over at his friend. That was an odd statement. What type of stats? He asked. Civilians injured or killed and property damage, Izuku replied immediately. Some are better than others. Rescue heroes, for example, don't usually cause property damage, or at least no more than any other rescue team, and sure, they have people die, but those people would have died anyway. But the combat heroes, some of them have terrible stats. Hitoshi nodded as they continued walking. Heroes were broken into a few types. There were the limelight heroes and underground heroes, but beyond that there were more delineations. There were rescue heroes, combat heroes and support heroes. Everyone knows that villains do damage. That they destroy property, injure or kill people, and most of them aren't that bad. They get caught before they can get that bad, but there's no reporting on the damage heroes do. It can't be all heroes? Hitoshi murmured. It's not, Izuku admitted. It's mostly the combat heroes. Hitoshi sighed. Who make up the top 15 or so positions on the hero rankings, he said. Top 27 actually, Izuku corrected. Isn't Hitoshi couldn't remember the hero exactly. Number 16 Exodus? Aren't they a support hero? Hitoshi asked. Not technically, Izuku allowed. Even so. They were getting close to their school now and there were more kids around them. Hitoshi got a few odd looks because he wasn't recognized, but he was surprised that no one was saying hello to Izuku. His friend didn't seem bothered, but Hitoshi knew how Izuku thrived on having friends. So who has the worst stats? He asked. All Might. Seriously? Izuku nodded and there was not even a ghost of a smirk gracing his lips, so Hitoshi knew he was telling the truth. Then Hitoshi remembered the battle. If we take out the battle your dad got injured in, does that make a difference? He sought clarification. Endeavor, Izuku answered immediately. Wait, what? You're telling me the first and second ranked heroes in Japan have the worst stats? Yep, Izuku said, popping the P. How? Hitoshi stuttered. He wasn't really sure what question he was trying to ask. How did he not already know this? How did the public not know? How did they maintain those ranks? There were a lot of questions. I'll tell you later, Izuku said as they came into view of the gates. Do you want to meet Ochako now? I think it will have to be at lunch, Hitoshi replied. I meant to go to the office, he told Izuku, remembering what his instructions had been when he went to the new school. I'll take you there. Izuku chirped, all hint of the heavy topics they had been discussing leaving his voice. Thanks. Ochako approached Izuku's classroom a little tentatively. They took turns going to each other's classrooms for lunch, and today Izuku said he'd have a surprise for her. She was a little nervous about that. He'd been different since his dad had been injured. Darker, more critical of everything. Her mum and dad told her it was inevitable. That Izuku was hurting and probably didn't have any other way of expressing that pain. She just had to be understanding, and let him know if he hurt her. He hadn't hurt her. Ochako didn't think Izuku would, but he did scare her slightly. He was so intense and the direction had changed. But he had seemed genuinely happy when he told her he had a surprise for her today, and that had been at her birthday. She shook her head. This was going to be a good thing, Ochako told herself, and stepped through the doorway into the classroom. She looked straight at Izuku's desk and saw that he'd already shifted it so that they'd have space to eat lunch, but there was a third desk there. Her eyes widened. There was another boy sitting there. He had purple hair and purple eyes, but he looked a bit tired. Ochako. Izuku's voice was genuinely happy when he saw her. He waved her over enthusiastically. This is Hitoshi, he introduced her happily. He moved here over winter break. Hitoshi, this is Ochako. The other boy gave her a smile. It showed his fond tolerance for Izuku. Hi, I'm Hitoshi Shinzo, he added his own introduction. Ochako Uraraka, she said, sitting down. I went to school with Izuku at his last school, Hitoshi told her. She felt a stab of jealousy at that. But then she remembered that Izuku had only spent a year at that school. She'd been to school with him for 2.5 years, so she had known him longer. That had to count for something, didn't it? Izuku was watching them both with a smile. It was genuinely happy. Izuku and I started school together, she replied. Internally, Ochako shook her head. She was being silly. Izuku had said many times that he wished all his friends could meet. It wasn't so that he could abandon any of them, it was because he thought they'd be friends as well. He wasn't going to like Hitoshi over her. Even if he was hurting, he wasn't like that. But I'm sure you've got lots of stories from last year? The boy grinned at her, as he took off the lid on his lunchbox. Do you know he got suspended? What? Ochako yelled in surprise. Izuku suspended? That did not make sense. Izuku? She turned to him, her eyes wide. How did he get suspended? You didn't know? Hitoshi asked, but you could tell he was laughing. I didn't tell her, Izuku said in a small voice. Hitoshi laughed. It wasn't anything bad, he told her. Just one of the other kids hated him. What? She said again, more quietly this time. How could anyone hate Izuku? He was so nice. She had a grudge and the teachers favored her. Don't worry about it, Hitoshi explained, shaking his head as if to dismiss the matter. Except, it wasn't that easy. Ochako needed more information. Izuku sighed and Ochako watched as he fished a croquet out of his lunchbox and put it into Hitoshi's. Then he fished out a small corn cob and put it in hers with a grin. It wasn't anything bad, Izuku said. You know that I've been learning self-defense with Kurogiri? Ochako nodded. Izuku had let her know that ages ago. She didn't like that it made me faster than her. Ha! It wasn't a great response. Izuku won our school sports festival. At least for our year, Hitoshi elaborated. She didn't like that, so she pulled a fake with her quirk and Izuku was suspended. How do you fake something with your quirk? Ochako asked. They weren't meant to use them during sports. Well, unless they were mutant type, then it couldn't be helped. Her quirk allowed her to break off parts of her body, Hitoshi said, picking up the croquet and biting into it. The crunch was audible even from where Ochako was sitting. It didn't hurt her, but she pretended it did. It wasn't bad, Izuku said with a shrug. I got to spend the week with my dad. Ochako nodded, then looked pensive. No change over the break? Izuku had refused to answer that question on her birthday. Izuku shook his head. No change. He's going to be on a respirator forever, he added, almost hissing. She looked at him sadly, not sure what to say. It's not your fault. Izuku picked up on her look. It's the hero's fault. Izuku, Ochako said softly. She didn't like the new direction he was taking. It is. He insisted. You were going to tell me about some statistics, Hitoshi said. What statistics? Ochako asked quickly, hoping it was a way to diffuse the situation or at least change the subject. Izuku swallowed a grape he'd just popped into his mouth with an ostentatious swallow, then he looked around before pulling out his phone. You're not meant to have that. The look Izuku gave her was more than enough to say, I know, and Ochako fell silent and watched as Izuku opened the screen and tapped for a few moments before he handed it over to Hitoshi. She got a glimpse of the screen and it looked to be text. What statistics? Ochako asked again, feeling ignored. You're not going to like them, Izuku said. They are about heroes, she concluded. They are, he replied as Hitoshi scrolled his way slowly through the phone. Izuku swallowed. I know you don't think it was the hero's fault that Dad was injured, he said softly. It was an accident, Ochako said, but she didn't feel the conviction she had felt before. No, Ochako, it was a raid. Izuku said. They were there to get Toxic Chainsaw, and they didn't make sure the civilians were evacuated, he explained. The first part of any raid is to make sure that those not involved do not get hurt. The first thing any hero should do is protect civilians, but they didn't. They cared so much about getting Toxic Chainsaw that they didn't act to protect the civilians. But that might have tipped off Toxic Chainsaw, she objected. It's their job. Izuku countered. And why did they go after such a dangerous villain in a commercial area? Couldn't they have waited until he was somewhere else? At that, Ochako was at a bit of a loss. Those points were true. I don't know. I don't either, Izuku sighed his response. But it does mean they are responsible. Obviously Toxic Chainsaw is the most responsible, but the heroes should have done better. What's making me really angry, Ochako, is that my dad isn't the first time this has happened. Wah? That's what the statistics are, Izuku told her. They are the true numbers from various hero fights. Usually the damage is blamed on the villain, but that's not always true. And how did you get that information? She asked, curious. Even as young as she was, she could see that if the information was that bad and available, the media would have put it everywhere. Kurogiri told me they come from a number of sources, and you have to cross-reference to get to the bottom of them. Dad's company JBQC provided some too, since they do large-scale construction and have access to those numbers via the building industry. Your parents could probably get those numbers from the union too. Ochako wasn't sure what to say about that, and before she could, Hitoshi sighed. Endeavor is the worst though, he commented, looking up from Izuku's phone. How'd you figure that? Izuku asked. Can I read them? Ochako asked at the same time. Izuku waved at Hitoshi to hand over his phone. Ochako took it, noting how warm Hitoshi's hand was. She scrolled to the beginning of the information. All Might has larger civilian losses but also large savings. Endeavor takes on fire villains and that collateral damage is larger. Hitoshi said. It's just a feeling. Plus, All Might donates more, so he's at least partially aware of the damage done. Tamara actually says you are right, Izuku grumbled. The two of them could tell that he didn't want to admit it. If you look at the numbers on a per capita basis, then Endeavor's figures are worse. You don't need to consider donations. But, Izuku growled this time, his eyes becoming hard in a way that Ochako was familiar with. He was not going to give on this point. It was All Might who took out Toxic Chainsaw, so for my dad, the responsibility lies there. Hitoshi sighed. You better read, he told her. Ochako nodded and looked down at the phone. The first heading was, the Hiratsuto incident, which she'd never heard of. There was a date under it, which was 11 years ago. They are in chronological order, Hitoshi told her, correctly interpreting her frown. No one cared about stuff that old. The description was simple. All Might fought an unknown villain, triggering a landslide. She scrolled down. There was a table underneath. Deaths 14. Injuries 53, of which 29 were catastrophic. Damage in excess of 2 billion yen. Ochako felt her eyes widen at the numbers and scrolled further. The next heading was under the table. The Komagame Fire. Endeavor fought Crossfire, real name Kane Netsu. The information was just as brief as the previous entry. The date was from 8 years previous. Deaths 6. Injuries 79, of which 14 were catastrophic. Damage in excess of 3 billion yen. Miss Uraraka, you know you are not allowed a phone during school hours. Ochako wasn't the only one to jerk at the teacher's voice. I will be taking that, Miss Haru said. She had the presence of mind to at least flick the screen to a menu before Ochako turned around in her chair and sheepishly offered up the phone. I'm sorry, Izuku said before Ochako could say anything. It's my phone. I was using it to check on my dad. Miss Haru turned to Izuku. Then why did Miss Uraraka have it? Izuku looked down and Ochako felt kind of sick. I was showing her an article I'd found. Miss Haru sighed. You know the rules, Mr. Chui. I'm confiscating your phone. You may collect it at the end of class today. Yes, ma'am, Izuku said softly. The teacher moved away. I'm so sorry. Ochako whispered frantically. Don't worry, Izuku replied easily. Where did you get up to? He asked instead. Only to Komagame, she said, happy that the matter seemed to be dealt with. The others are the same. Hitoshi told her. There's a whole list of incidents, all the way down to late last year. And they are all the same? Izuku nodded. I'll send you the document when I get my phone back. He really wasn't concerned. But why don't we know about this? Ochako asked. Izuku looked sadly at her. It took me a while to learn this, but it's because heroes are controlled by the Hero Public Safety Commission and they need heroes to have a good reputation. So they won't let through bad publicity. Hence we don't find out about the bad things. Until they happen to you. Ochako gulped at Izuku's last words. There was a note she didn't recognize in his voice. It was one of deep feeling. But, apparently Izuku could sense her apprehension. He gave her a sad smile. It's okay. I know it's hard, but you'll see it eventually, he told her. We should finish lunch, Hitoshi broke in, jerking his head towards the clock. And the tension disappeared, but Ochako remembered it and she wasn't sure what to think, but she knew things had changed. End chapters 60 and 61, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note, catastrophic injury is actually a term that means life-changing, something you don't recover from. We are talking spinal cord injuries, amputations, internal injuries, loss of sight, hearing or other senses, multiple bone fractures and head and traumatic brain injuries. All for one qualifies on at least 3 of them: amputation, of head, loss of sight and smell, probably other bone fractures, and head and traumatic brain injuries because they don't get much worse than that. All might also qualifies on internal injuries and probably a whole heap of bone fractures. So in the battle, they both did a number on each other. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.